4-lesson series on the 70-week prophecy in Daniel tonight, and we'll go back to the book of Revelation next Sunday evening. I think we were somewhere in the 13th chapter. We're getting close to the number 666. So in Daniel 9, let me read that for us, 25 and 26. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street that shall be built again in the wall, even in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood until the end of the war. Desolations are determined. So we were discussing what happens after the Messiah shall be cut off. And wanted to talk a little bit more about the history of Jerusalem in the time frame of 66 to 70 AD. And there were amongst the Jewish people, though, about 65, 66 AD, there were amongst the Jewish people, and mainly amongst the religious elite, there grew a group that became bolder and bolder in their protest against the Roman presence in their city, in Jerusalem. And these were people that had grown to hate and despise the Romans. And you know, that was one of the issues with Jesus. Because Jesus didn't say, you need to rise up and revolt. So they didn't like him for that. But these people, and that was part of the reason they hated Jesus, but these people grew louder and louder in their hatred of the Romans. And there was a fanatical group. You know, we have the Zealots. And the Zealots were famous for carrying these small daggers, and they roamed around the streets at night. And if they found themselves in a position of numerical superiority over Roman soldiers, they would slay them, they would kill them. And as you get into 66 and 67, society, the general order of society, is starting to deteriorate. There's more and more violence everywhere. And finally, there's an open revolt. And in the month of May of 66, and the Jewish zealots and rebels actually overrun the Roman garrison. They're able to overwhelm the soldiers, and Jerusalem falls under the control of the zealots, of the rebels. They literally took back their city. And the first thing they said they were going to do, the first thing they did was to stop the sacrifices to the emperor. That's a significant thing, to stop the sacrifices to the emperor. So they abolished emperor worship. And in effect, when they did that, they declared war on Rome, which wasn't a good idea when you were a small, in essence, a city-state on the Mediterranean Sea. So this tiny country rebelled against Rome. Rebellion swept the countryside. And Nero, at that time the emperor, knew he had to do something, and he sent in his troops with General Titus Flavius Vespasian. And that's a man he was a brilliant soldier who had distinguished himself in the conquest of Britain, which was a tough war for the Romans to defeat the Brits. And now he's sent in here to do something about the uprising in Israel. And he brought 3 legions with him, and he brought in numerous auxiliaries, and he attacked Galilee first of all from the north. And by October of 67, he had generally subdued most of Galilee. And that's where Josephus comes from. Josephus was a captive of the conquest of Galilee, the historian and the Jewish historian who then came under the auspices of the Romans. So that was when, did you know that there were 6,000 Jewish slaves taken from Galilee, and they were sent to Greece to build something. Did you know that? Have any of you ever seen the Corinthian Channel? The Corinthian Channel, which is really an engineering marvel, was originally begun by 6,000 Jewish slaves. It wasn't finished because they couldn't finish it. It was too hard. But it was finished in the 1800s. But that was the first attempt to build the Corinthian Channel. So quite an engineering feat. But those people were taken, they were sent there by this General Titus. And by the following spring, Titus began to center more on the city of Jerusalem. That's the way the Romans usually did things. They subdued the countryside, and that did one or two things. You either killed the people in the countryside or they ran to the cities. Okay? So then what do? You go to the city. That's where everybody's going to end up. They've either left town or they're in the city by now. They've left the country or they're in the city. So in the middle of that, though, during this time frame, Nero lost his mind. He was a crazy man. And he committed suicide. And that wasn't a real big loss to the world. But when he did, Rome immediately went into civil war. So everything on the periphery of Rome kind of settled down. It was kind of in suspension. And there was a series of 3 emperors, none of which were any good. And they were all really insignificant from a historical perspective. But after a while, the General Titus Vespasian that we mentioned became the new emperor. And then things came back to order. So when he left, when he went back to Rome, as these military generals often did, he left his son Titus in control. And in the spring of 70, Titus appeared outside the city of Jerusalem, ready to take on the rebels, and he had a little over 100,000 troops. In the city were about 200,000 people, men, women, and children. And 100,000 was more than enough to do the job. And they attacked with this Roman artillery. They called it scorpions. And they were these they're like catapults that shot multiple objects. And they were designed to destroy the inner portion of the city and to destroy the exterior wall. And they throw rocks and these things that are on fire. So they beat up the city, and then they actually built a mound entirely around the city. A mound. And that way they could stand up on the mound and look and see anybody that walked away from the city. And Josephus said that during the height of it's considered to be a siege, 500 people a day were hung on crosses. 500 a day. And as I told you last week, the forest around Jerusalem that once was there was literally destroyed in making crosses and battering rams and other machines of war. And they literally stripped the entire area of any trees. And historians tell us that there were so many people dying and dead that you couldn't stand the odor of the air. People were too weak to bury the people that were dead, so they just laid out in the streets as the entire city is surrounded. And people begin to die mainly of starvation. This is what Josephus wrote. And remember, Josephus is a Jew, okay? He's talking about his own people. He says, the terrible famine that increased in frightfulness daily annihilated whole families of the people. The terraces were full of women and children who had collapsed from hunger. The alleys were piled high with bodies of the aged. Children and young people, swollen with lack of food, wandered around like ghosts until they fell. They were so far spent that they could no longer bury anyone, and if they did, they fell dead upon the very corpses that they were burying. The misery was unspeakable, for as soon as even the shadow of anything eatable appeared, A fight began over it, and the best of friends fought each other and tore from each other the most miserable of trifles. No one would believe that a dying person had no provisions stored away. So when they died, robbers threw themselves upon them as they were drawing their last breath and ransacked their clothing and all their personal belongings. These robbers ran about reeling and staggering like mad dogs and hammered on the doors of houses like drunken men. In their despair, they often plunged into the same house 2 or 3 times in a day. Their hunger was so unbearable they were forced to chew and eat anything. They laid hands on things that even the meanest of animals wouldn't touch, far less eat. They had long since eaten their belts and their shoes and even their leather jackets, which were torn to shreds and chewed. And by the way, they also ate their children. Many of them ate old hay. And then Josephus continues. He says, "Why should I describe the shame and the indignity that famine brought upon men, making them eat such unnatural things? Because I tell of things unknown to history, whether Greek or barbarian. It is frightful to speak of and unbelievable to hear of it. I should gladly have passed over this disaster in silence, so that I might not get the reputation of recording something that must appear in posterity wholly degrading. But there were too many eyewitnesses in time. Apart from that, my country would have little cause to be grateful to me were I to be silent about the misery which it endured at this time." Josephus attempted to record how many people died each day. Oftentimes he was recording figures of over 2,000 people a day dying. As the city began to deteriorate, the Romans began more and more aggressively attempting to burn it to the ground. And by August of 70, Roman soldiers had occupied the city, and they had erected their banners in the sacred places, and they had begun to sacrifice to their idols. Murder and plunder followed, and it was total devastation. So when you go back to our text, when you go back to Daniel 9:26, and you read, "Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary." This is the people of the prince. And it said that it will come, and we had mentioned, the end of it shall be like a flood. And this is part of that flood. Unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. In a single day, finally, Jerusalem fell completely, but that wasn't the end of it. Not long after that, the Romans went into Damascus and killed 10,000 Jews in Damascus in one day. In one day. They wiped out all the Jews in that city. Many Jews were taken into captivity and served as gladiators in their games, as did Christians. Do you know one of the signs of a society that is starting to crumble? It's preoccupation with sports. The Greeks, the Olympics, the Romans, the Colosseum, America. As long as you leave golf alone, we're okay. But when you think about it, from that time forward, and their history wasn't real illustrious even at that time, but that time forward, it was desolation upon desolation. When the first crusade was launched in 1096, the people wanted to go on the crusades. They went under the auspices of going back to capture the Holy Land. But they had one great fear. You know what the Crusaders' greatest fear was? When they took back the Holy Land, who would want it? Jews. So you know what they did? As they came through Europe, whenever they ran into the Jews, they killed them all. And they did that under the auspices of being Christians. So they wiped out whole Jewish communities on their way to the Holy Land. In the Second Crusade in 1146, the slaughter probably numerically exceeded the slaughter of the First Crusade. Later in 1290, King Edward ordered the Jews out of England. In 1348 and 1349, the Black Death was blamed upon the Jews. They were accused of having poisoned the wells. So the Jews eventually, they ran to two countries. Do you know what two countries they migrated to in Europe? Poland and Russia. They felt relatively safe in Poland, and they felt safe in Russia because of the vastness of the country, not necessarily because of the people. And that's why there are still large Jewish populations in both those countries. But in 1894, the Jews were abused in France. It's called the Dreyfus Affair. And of course, we know what happened to the Jews under the Stalin-led massacre in Russia, and of course, under Hitler in 1940, over 6 million Jews were slaughtered.
In Spain, it's...
Oh yeah. The history of the Jewish people is one of desolation upon desolation, slaughter upon slaughter. So after 483 years, the Messiah would be cut off, and there would be, as our text says, desolation in the land, and that's what's happened. And it still hasn't ended. And by 1914, there were over 90,000 Jews had gone back to the Holy Land, even though they had no country. And that's what really began the idea behind a nation for the Jews, as they were so noted under UN Charter in 1948. But why has this happened? Yeah, it was a result of their disobedience. But for what did it happen? Well, it happened for verse 27. If you look at verse 27, it says, "Then he," and who is he? Yeah. Usually in Scripture, whenever you read the
It's not Catholic.
I know it's not supposed to. It's the Antichrist. Usually in Scripture, when you read the word he, it refers to the last person that was named. So who was the last person that was named?
The Antichrist, the prince.
He was the prince who is to come. So it says, "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week." So the Jews have gone through this historical desolation upon desolation, so that they would be prepared, in my mind, for this time. "And the prince shall come," and the proper antecedent there is he. "And he shall confirm a covenant." Some will say league, some will say treaty, different words in different versions, all essentially the same thing. And what it is it's an agreement. So,
Is that 7-year treaty that we've watched for?
yes. So this is the time frame between the 69th week, when Messiah is cut off, and the 70th week. And what we have is, because we know that the ending of the 69th week, according to the people that we've referred to in our study, are people that believe that day was when Jesus entered Jerusalem in triumph and was hailed as the Messiah. So after that day, because Robertson and Hoyner are both specific on that particular day, they take it to the exact day. After that, there has to be a crucifixion. There has to be a resurrection. All these things start to happen. And I've never been bothered by the gap, because in prophecy there's all kinds of gaps. If you look at Isaiah 9:6, it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders." He's born, And then in the next phrase, the government's on his shoulders. There's a huge gap there, because that's in reference to the millennial kingdom. But you see, so I'm not too concerned about that. But there's a great period, a great gulf here that was unperceived by the Old Testament prophets. And you can wonder why. You can understand why. That's what Peter says. In 1 Peter 1:11, he speaks of searching what, or what manner of time. The what in that statement is Jesus, and the manner of time is the when of his return, what manner of time. So people just didn't call it, didn't understand the whole idea. Paul calls it the mystery period in some of his writings. It's like a parenthesis. So, and what is the parenthesis? It's the church age. It's the age of the church. And that's why the Lord would say, because if the entire period ran consecutively, what would happen? We would know when Jesus returned, right? We would have a time. But Jesus said, no one knows the day nor the hour. It's not for you to know the time or the season. So if it was exactly 490 years, we'd all know it. But the gap means none of us know. So back in verse 27, he shall confirm a covenant with many, it says, for 1 week. The Antichrist makes a league with them for 7 years, and that's an important part. So he comes before them as a great hero. Frankly, why? How would you like to be an Israeli today and know that you're surrounded by people on 3 sides, the other side is the Mediterranean Sea, who all want to push you into that sea? To know that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon with one intent, to use it in your homeland. Do you think that there's a level of anxiety in Israel?
Anxiety and angst as well.
Yeah. So here you have these people, and the Antichrist comes before them. You know, Israel tries to hang on to its friends. It will forgive a lot of ills to hang on to their friends. But they're getting pressured from all sides. And really, we don't hear a lot about it here, but one of their greatest oppressors is Russia. Russia's been after them for quite a long time, I believe. I've always thought because they wanted a Mediterranean seaport. But so here you have a new person that comes on the scene that is some way allied with this Holy Roman Empire that is revived, a confederated Europe. We don't seem to be on the scene. We're a long ways away, and I think we'll probably be impotent by then to be able to help. But we have a colossal, in some ways, this individual, the Antichrist, comes forward, and when this great final confederacy of the Holy Roman Empire reemerges, the little horn, he is prepared to become the one great world leader, and this world ruler will come, and he's going to, when things look dire in Israel, he's going to come and, don't worry, I'll rescue you.
Give you peace.
That's right. Don't worry, I'll rescue you. And if you look at Ezekiel, Israel becomes so secure. I remember reading it. It talks about them that they live in, they begin to live in unwalled villages. It just means they let down all of their concern. They let down all of their defense because they figure we're finally free from that oppression. So they believe that they're well protected. And so they make this covenant with the Antichrist, the final ruler of the revived Roman Empire. But the problem with that is he's a liar. And so it says in the middle of 27, it says in verse 27, in the middle of the week, 3.5 years, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Oblation. Oblation is the word in the King James. Oblation. Comes from the Latin oblatio. It means means to give up an offering, to offer up an offering. And so before, what has to happen before sacrifice and offering can cease? Well, before you can stop it, you have to have it. So there has to come a time in your outline, a sacrifice and an offering. And before you have a sacrifice and offering, what do you have to have? You have to have a place to have an offering and a sacrifice, exactly. And that's one of the things I believe that the Antichrist is going to assist them in, the nation Israel. And that will be something that will make them so enamored with him. It will be the restoration of the temple. And I don't know how it's going to come to pass. I imagine because of his words. Because the Antichrist, remember the Antichrist comes and he has a bow, but what doesn't he have? He ain't got no arrows. Comes as a man of peace. His words are what mystify people. He's able to, and there is a sense of force behind him, but it's his words that that do most of his work. So he gets them to sign this treaty, and I think in that treaty is probably the idea you can rebuild your temple, because are the Jews ready to rebuild their temple?
Yes,
They've got everything. They've got it all in storage. They're ready to go. Just give them the word. So the rebuilding of the temple would not take long at all, as soon as you get rid of that dome of the rock that's on top of it. And by the way, and that idea of the bow is from Revelation 6. We've already studied that. But like I said, it seems that he's actually a conqueror by peace. So he has to be a great statesman. He speaks great things, but he seems to be able to negotiate the things that Israel wants, mainly security, a temple, and he lets them have their worship. Those are all important things, are they not? The Jewish people. Security, a temple, a place to worship. But in the middle of the 7 years, we come to the Great Tribulation. He stops the whole thing. And in its place, he brings an overspreading now of abominations, and he turns the temple into desolation. And it remains desolate until the consummation that is determined to be poured out upon it. And he stops. So right in the middle of everything, he stops everything. And we saw a preview of that. Remember, there's an Old Testament person that we saw a preview of that with. Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember him who he went into he was the cause of the Maccabean revolt. He went into the temple, and what did he do? Slaughtered a pig on the altar, and he took the portions of the pigs and shoved it down the priest's throats. So that hit a lot of folks pretty upset. So that was a foretaste of what this guy's going to do. So what abominates the temple of God? Will this be a temple of God?
Well, won't they be sacrificing there?
It'll be a
To
temple
their
of God.
living God?
So what abominates the temple of God?
The Antichrist sets up this idol, doesn't he?
Another God. Remember we were looking Wednesday night? When the Ark of the Covenant, when the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant, they took it home with them. And what did they do?
They got boils.
They took it and they set it in the temple next to their God. And what happened the first night? Remember who was their God? He's not a mermaid, he's a man-made. He's a man-mer. He's a mermaid. He's a merman. He's not a woman fish, he's a man fish. And they put the Ark of the Covenant there, and they put him here, and what happened to him? He bowed down to it. So they came in the next morning, they put him back up, and then what happened to him? He bowed down to it, but he was minus his head and his hands. So they said, this isn't a good thing. We got to do something. And then they started getting sick, so what did they do with the Ark of the Covenant? They sent it around the whole country. Everybody gets sick. Real smart. But that's the ultimate abuse of God. That's the ultimate abomination, is to have an idol. That's why I talk about idolatry so much. going to set up himself. And that's what the Bible says. He will set up himself as God. And if you look at Revelation 13:5, he'll speak great things and blasphemies. And the power will be given for him to continue for how long in this mode? He gets to continue for 42 months, 3.5 years. So it's the second 3.5 years, and he puts himself in power, and he opens his mouth, and he blasphemes God. Remember, we've looked at this before? He blasphemes his name, he blasphemes his tabernacle, he even blasphemes those who dwell in heaven. Everybody. And he's given, it says it's given unto him to make war with the saints, to overcome them. And he continues on and on. And he establishes himself as the one to be worshipped. And then in verse 15, remember it says, there is an image of the beast set up, and he is to be worshipped, as many as would not worship the image of the beast. What happens to them? You're eliminated, you're killed, you're removed. 2 Thessalonians tells us of him setting himself up as God. I've often thought it interesting during that first 3.5 years, the apostate church exists, but what happens after when he becomes the ruler? He eliminates the apostate church because there needs to be no more apostate church. He is God. You don't need a church. It's all about him. Because actually I think the word says he devours the apostate church, or the false church, as it's called. He devours Israel, he devours the church, he devours, there's nothing left of religion except for him. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. What was the Roman style of worship? He's the new ruler of the revived Holy Roman Empire. He is in fact the new emperor. In the Roman Empire, who did you worship? The empire. The
Caesar.
emperor, yeah. Caesar and Augustus and all those other guys. March, February, and everybody else. But that goes on for 3.5 years, and he makes the place desolate, and then it says in verse 27, and on the wings of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, okay, is poured out on the desolate. And that takes us up about to the end of the study on the 70-week prophecy. Go back to that 24th verse, though. What does it say back in the 24th? 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. And then what happens? This is the end. This is really the end. It's at the beginning, but it's really the end. What happens at the end? What's the next word? To finish the transgression. To make an end of sins. There will be no more sins. To make reconciliation for iniquity. To bring in everlasting righteousness. To seal up vision and prophecy. And to anoint the most holy. So in those phrases there, you really have the destruction of the Antichrist. When he says to finish the transgression and make an end of sins, the Antichrist can't exist in that kind of condition. It has to be his elimination. So, and then there's a reconciliation of inequity, and he brings in the righteousness of the ages, and he seals up the visions and prophecies, and he anoints the Holy of Holies, I believe is a better translation, rather than to anoint the most holy. It's the Holy of Holies, and what is that? That would be the kingdom of God. That would be the millennial kingdom. So, an incredible prophecy. I hope, do you understand in 4 weeks what we've tried to study? In 4 weeks, you now know, if you didn't know, the history of the world. This is the end history of the world. This is how this world, this temporary world that we're all so enamored with, that we run around like wild chickens to do well in this world, that's how this temporal, slight, minuscule world will end. And then you'll get to see the real world. The spiritual world. Because the spiritual world is the real world. Not this world. The prosperity you have in this world is nothing compared to the prosperity that you will have in God's world. So I hope you see that this is really the history of the world. And Jesus said it, that this was hidden from the wise and from the prudent. And he revealed it to who? Well, he revealed it to me, so that means he revealed it to goofballs. Actually, it says he revealed it to the babes. Do you know that? Jesus revealed this to the babes. That's who we are. 2 Peter 3, Peter says, listen to 2 Peter 3:11. Since all these things will be dissolved, all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? Since none of this matters, what kind of person should you be tonight? That's what Peter says. In verse 12, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, as we understand them, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for, don't worry about those heavens melting, look for, Peter says, new heavens. And what else? A new earth. Not this raggedy earth that people running around, they're hugging trees, they're kissing whales, they're petting spotted owls, they're letting people die of starvation to save a little fish in the river. This world's going to go away, and we're going to get back paradise. It's going to be perfect. Therefore, beloved, he says, therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent. Be diligent. Do you understand that word? Be diligent to be found by him in peace. Listen, this is how Christians are supposed to be found by Christ when he returns. You're to be in peace. You're to be without spot and blameless. Yeah. That's the expectation that the Lord has of you. And that would be my prayer for us as God's people. You know, we know these things, correct? So the expectation for us should be holy and godly living. Holiness and godliness. And since we look upon these things, we know, listen, do you think Jesus could come pretty soon? The time is right. We know the time is right. So, let me ask you this. If there's sin in your life today, and you're thinking, well, I don't need to take care of that. I got time. When will be the time to take care of it? What do you want? Would you like a letter? You want to get a letter? Return address heaven. Steve, it's time to repent. Steve, it's time to get that sin out of your life. Because that's God's expectation for us. But we know that the 70th week could start at any moment. You know, the 70th week isn't about you and me, is it? If we're children of God, who's the 70th week all about? It's all about Israel. Okay? The 70th week is about Israel. The first 69, we weren't in the first 69. That was all about Israel. We're the gap, and the 70th week is all about Israel. So if you sit here and you go, yeah, Jesus can come anytime, well then let's take care of our business with him. Let's take care of anything that's an impediment between us and him.
We're to be loving one another. You know, as believers, we're to be loving one another.
Yeah, but we can struggle with that process sometimes. And there's fewer things that can sorrow a pastor more than when people in the body struggle to love one another. So